Orchestrated fresh memoir narrative with new characters and emotional arc. Orchestrated fresh memoir narrative with new characters and emotional arc. The night my daughter-in-law stood up at my son's 40th birthday and announced to a table of 20 guests that he couldn't be trusted to sign his own name, and her mother laughed and reached over to pat the back of his hand the way you'd quiet a fussy child, I didn't make a sound. I didn't push back my chair. I didn't ask her who she thought she was. I dabbed my mouth with the cloth napkin, set it beside my plate, and told the table I'd be right back. Then I walked past the dessert cart and the hostess station and out to the little hallway by the restrooms, and I made one phone call that took apart, brick by careful brick, the thing those two women had spent 6 years building. But I'm running ahead of myself, and that's not how this should be told. Cruelty almost never announces itself as cruelty. It comes in soft, smelling like something expensive, and that is exactly what makes it so hard to name. My name is Bernadette Quinn. I'm 67, and I live in a gray clapboard house on a ridge outside Asheville, North Carolina, where the fog sits in the valley most mornings until the sun burns it off around 10. I spent 34 years as a nurse, and the last 19 of those as a forensic examiner, the one they called in at 2 in the morning to sit with a woman in a paper gown and photograph what someone had done to her, to swab and measure and write it all down in handwriting that would later be read aloud in a courtroom. I had seen the worst of it. I had held the hands of women whose husbands were deacons, whose husbands coached Little League, whose husbands everyone described as the nicest man you could ever hope to meet. I believed, and I'm ashamed to say it now, that all those years had made me impossible to fool. I thought I could spot the thing in a crowded room from across the floor. I was wrong, and the reason I was wrong is that I was looking for it in the wrong place. I kept watching for it to happen to a woman. I never once thought to look for it happening to my son. My boy is named Jonah, and he came late when I'd given up. He was the kind of child who cried when other children got hurt on the playground, who carried spiders outside in a cup instead of stepping on them. He grew up to build instruments, violins, mandolins, the occasional fine guitar, in a little workshop off the highway with sawdust in the air and the smell of spruce and varnish in everything he owned. He wasn't a man who chased money. He'd spend 3 months on a single cello and charge half what it was worth because he liked the customer. His father used to shake his head and say the boy had been born without the part that protects you. I used to laugh at that. I don't laugh at it anymore. His father, my Daniel, died 4 years before the birthday dinner, dropped in the garden one Sunday afternoon with the hose still running, gone before the ambulance turned off the main road, 41 years of marriage, and then a hose running into the tomatoes, and a silence I am still not all the way out of. I tell you this because I think grief is the door these things walk through. When you are drowning in your own loss, you don't have the eyes to watch anyone else go under. Jonah came to the funeral hollowed out. He'd been close to his daddy in that quiet, working with your hands way men sometimes are. And about 8 months later, when a woman started coming around who seemed to fill the hole his father left, who listened to him talk about the curve of an instrument's back like it was the most fascinating thing she'd ever heard, I was so relieved he wasn't alone that I didn't ask a single hard question, not one. Her name was Sloane. She sold real estate, the high-end kind, the lake houses and the mountain estates, and she was good at it because she could make you feel, for as long as she was looking at you, like you were the only person who had ever mattered. The first time Jonah brought her to my house, she walked through my front door, took both my hands, and called me Mama before she'd earned the right to even call me Bernadette. I remember thinking it was forward. I remember deciding it was sweet instead, because that was the kinder thing to think, and because I wanted so badly for my son to be happy. The first year of the marriage, from the outside, looked like a magazine. They bought a place above the river with a wall of windows. She redecorated his workshop without asking, and when he came home to find his tools rearranged and his order book in a new system he didn't understand, he laughed it off, said she was just trying to help. She was attentive to me, too. Flowers on my porch, a card on Daniel's birthday, a phone call to check whether I'd taken my blood pressure pills. I told myself I'd been a fool to ever feel that flicker of unease at my own front door. Old habits, I thought. You spend 20 years cataloging harm and you start seeing it where it isn't. Then her mother arrived. Glenda had been a bank branch manager for 30 years before she retired, and she carried herself like she was still signing off on everyone's loans. She moved up from Columbia about 6 months into the marriage, into a condo 10 minutes from the kids, and she came as a package. The opinions, the management, the certainty. She had a way of saying terrible things in a voice as smooth as butter. She'd touch your arm. She'd smile while she did it. The first time I really understood what she was, we were all on the back deck, and Jonah mentioned he'd turned down a big commission because he didn't like how the client talked to his apprentice, and Glenda set down her sweet tea and said gently, "Now, sweetheart, this is exactly why Sloan has to keep the checkbook. Good thing one of you has a head for the world." And everybody chuckled. And my son chuckled too. But I watched his ears go red, and I watched him glance at his wife to see if she'd defend him. And I watched her not. That glance is the thing I cannot forget. My boy, who used to argue with his shop teacher in the 10th grade because he had a better idea about jointing wood, checking another person's face to find out whether he was allowed to have made a decision in his own life. I drove home that night with my hands tight on the wheel and a stone in my chest. Something was wrong. Not the kind of wrong with a clean name. Not the kind that leaves marks a camera can see. The kind that goes after the parts of a person that don't show up in a photograph. The spine, the voice, the small, everyday certainty that you have a right to your own opinions. I started paying attention after that, the way I'd been trained to and had forgotten how to use on my own family. The signs were everywhere once I let myself look. Jonah stopped coming to Sunday supper at my house. Sloan preferred they keep Sundays for her mother, he explained, and then he didn't quite meet my eyes. His 2 best friends from high school, fellows he'd known since they were boys, catching crawdads in the creek, stopped getting invited to anything. Sloan said one of them drank too much and the other was a bad influence, and besides, they brought a low energy into the house. He sold his truck, the old Ford he'd rebuilt with his father, because he said they were consolidating to one vehicle to save money. But it was Sloan who had the car, and Jonah who, when he needed to drive somewhere, had to ask her, and tell her where, and tell her how long. The workshop went next. They folded it into an LLC. Sloan handled the paperwork, Glenda co-signed something at the bank, and the way it was explained to me over coffee, all sunshine and good sense, it sounded like a smart thing prosperous people do. What it actually meant was that my son no longer owned the business he'd built with his own 2 hands. His name was on the lease and on the debt, and nowhere on the part that mattered. He worked 12-hour days making instruments and didn't have access to the account the money went into. Sloan gave him cash for gas and lunch. A grown man, a master craftsman with a waiting list of customers, counting out singles in his own truck, except he didn't have a truck anymore. I learned this the day I met him for lunch, and the check came, and he went pale and patted his pockets, and said he must have left his wallet, and I paid, and he wouldn't look at me, and I understood that there was no wallet. There was nothing in a wallet to leave. And there was a baby by then. A little girl. We named her Ren. Well, they named her, but I'd suggested it and they kept it, which I held on to like a small warm coal. She was 3 when all this was happening with her father's serious eyes. And here is the thing nobody tells you about how the cage gets built. The child is the lock. Because the day Jonah might have walked out, He had a daughter in that house, and walking out meant walking out on her, and they both knew it, and they used it. Sloane said it lightly, the way she said everything that cut deepest. I just don't know how you'd manage her on your own, baby. You can barely manage yourself. She said it smiling. Glenda nodded along like a witness confirming testimony. I want to tell you about one afternoon in particular, because it is the one that woke me all the way up. I stopped by the workshop unannounced. I'd learned to come unannounced, and found Jonah out back, leaning against the wall, hands shaking, not from cold. He'd dropped a finished violin. Stepped on it by accident, he said. A thing worth $4,000, and he was standing there working out loud, low, like a man practicing for an exam, how he was going to tell her, rehearsing his own apology, trying out which words might keep it from becoming a 3-day silence or a scene in front of the baby, or a phone call to Glenda who would then come over and sit at the table and explain to him in that buttery voice all the ways he was a disappointment. I have stood in trauma bays and kept my face still while I documented things that would make a grown man faint. So I kept my face still then, too. I didn't grab him. I didn't cry, though Lord knows I wanted to. I said, "Sweetheart, instruments break. You'll build another one, prettier than that. Come help me carry these boxes." And I changed the subject because I knew from 19 years of this work that if I named it out loud right then, in that parking lot, he would defend her. Not because he loved her, because the cost of saying the truth had been made so high that silence felt like the only door he had left. People who are being controlled protect the person controlling them. It looks like loyalty. It's a survival reflex, and it's the cruelest part of the whole machine. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there thinking about Daniel, about what he would have done. He'd have driven over there and stood Jonah up and said, "Son, that's enough. Come home." But Daniel was gone, and rage without a plan is just a man yelling into a phone before they hang up on him. I'd seen too many women march in furious and get nothing for it but a worse situation and a longer road. I knew that being right and being effective are two different animals. So instead of driving anywhere, I got up, made coffee at 3 in the morning, and called the one person I knew could tell me whether I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. Her name is Lucille, and she ran the domestic violence program at the hospital where I'd worked for 16 years. I told her everything, plain, the way you'd present a case, the isolation, the money, the rehearsed apologies, the mother who functioned like a foreman on a job site. I told her I felt insane saying it about a man, that some part of me kept waiting for her to laugh and tell me I was making mountains out of marriage. Lucille didn't laugh. She let me finish. Then she said something I'll carry to my grave. She said, "Bernadette, you've been looking at this for 30 years. You know what it is. The only reason you doubt yourself is that he's your son and the man, and the world taught you both that men don't get caged. Write it down. Start tonight. Dates, words, who was there, and don't tip your hand. Whatever you do, don't let them see you see it." So I became the harmless mother-in-law. I want you to understand how deliberate that was. I let Glenda condescend to me about my little house and my old-fashioned ways. I let Sloane manage me the way she managed everyone, accepting the flowers, returning the syrupy phone calls, agreeing that, yes, Jonah did need a lot of looking after, bless his heart. I went to their house and I praised the new throw pillows. I learned to lie with a calm I'm not proud of, and I kept a green notebook in my purse, and after every visit I sat in my car in their driveway and wrote down exactly what had been said and done, with the date and the time, in the same clean print I'd used for evidence my whole working life. Because I knew one thing from all those years, on the worst nights of strangers' lives, People who are sure they cannot be touched eventually stop being careful. Glenda and Sloane had never been caught. They'd never had to be careful in their lives. That was going to be their undoing. The details piled up the way they do in a real case. No single one a smoking gun, all of them together, a pattern you couldn't explain away. The bank account he had no card for, the phone she'd put a tracker on, for safety. The way Wren, 3 years old, had learned to go very quiet and still when Mama's voice changed. A child should not know how to do that, and a child who knows how to do that has learned it somewhere. And the worst of it, the thing that made my blood stop, I found out, slowly, that Sloane had begun telling people Jonah was unwell, that he was depressed, unstable, that she was so worried about him, that she didn't know if he was safe around the baby. She said it to her hairdresser. She said it to the women at her church. She built him a reputation as a fragile, failing man, brick by brick, so that on the day he ever tried to tell the truth, the whole town would already have been told he was crazy. Glenda helped. Glenda was good at it. Glenda had spent 30 years deciding who was trustworthy and who wasn't, and now she was using that face, that voice, that authority to make my gentle boy look like a danger to his own child. And then, on a Tuesday evening in March, my phone rang from a number I didn't know, and a man's voice, shaking, said, "Mrs. Quinn, you don't know me. My name is Nolan. I was married to Sloane before your son was. I've been trying to work up the nerve to call you for almost a year." I sat down on the bottom step of my staircase, and I did not move for the better part of an hour. Nolan had married her when he was 28. Glenda had moved in within a year, just like she had with my son. It started, he said, with suggestions that he dressed wrong, talked wrong, didn't earn enough, embarrassed her in front of people who mattered. It ended with him sitting in his own kitchen being told by 2 women that he was sick, that he needed help, that no one would believe him over them. They controlled the money. They controlled the calendar. And when he finally tried to leave, they didn't hit him. They did something more permanent. They told everyone, including a judge, that he was mentally unstable and possibly dangerous, and they did it so well, with such smooth and reasonable concern, that he came within a hair of losing everything. He had no children to lose, thank God, and he got out. But it cost him 5 years, and most of who he used to be, and he carried it like a stone, and the reason he'd finally found the courage to call was that a woman from Sloane's church, one of the only people who'd ever doubted her, had mentioned to a mutual friend that the new husband, the one who built violins, seemed to be going through what you went through. Here is the part that mattered. Nolan had kept things. Not because he'd planned to, but because he'd been too scared to throw them away. He had text messages, Glenda coaching Sloane in writing on exactly what to say to make him look unhinged. He had a voicemail. He had bank records from the joint accounts that showed the same pattern of money moving into an entity in Glenda's name. He put it all in a folder in a safe deposit box 5 years ago and tried to forget it existed, waiting, though he didn't know it, for the day it would finally do some good. That day had come. I did not run to Jonah with a folder and dump it in his lap. I'd learned that much, both from the work and from being his mother. You can't free a person by ambushing them with proof. Proof is for the courtroom, not the kitchen table. I waited until a Saturday when Sloane took Wren to her mother's, and I sat my son down in my own living room, the one with his father's chair still by the window, and I held both his hands, and I told him about Nolan. I didn't show him anything. I just told him there had been a man before him who'd lived the same 6 years, who'd been told the same things in the same voice, who'd come within an inch of being declared insane by the same 2 women, and who had survived. I watched my son's face, and what came over it was not shock. That's how I knew for certain. It was recognition. The terrible, slow loosening of a man hearing someone else describe the inside of his own head, the thing he believed was his private failure, given a name and a shape, and, worst and best of all, a precedent. He was quiet a long time. Then he said, very softly, "She told me I was the problem in his marriage too. She told me he was abusive and I should never bring him up because it upset her." He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. "She got ahead of it. She told me about him before I could ever find out about him." And then my son cried. Not the careful, swallowed crying he'd learned in that house. The real kind, the kind that comes up from the floor of a person, years of it, until there's nothing left and the shaking finally stops. I held him the way I'd held him when he was small and the world had been unkind. And when he could finally speak, he said 4 words I had been waiting for without knowing it. He said, "I want my daughter." The next 2 months were the hardest of both our lives, and the most dangerous, because Aunt Lucille had warned me about this in plain terms. The moment a person decides to leave is the moment the one controlling them escalates. The leaving is when they reach for the most extreme thing they've got because they've nothing left to lose. So we did not announce anything. We built the team first. Lucille connected me with an advocate who'd guided dozens of people out of exactly this kind of slow-motion ruin. We found a family attorney named Delia Burke who had spent her career watching wealthier and better-connected people than Glenda lose in court because the truth, properly documented, has a weight that money can't lift. We brought in a forensic accountant who traced where my son's earnings had gone for 3 years, every dollar, into accounts Sloan and her mother controlled and Jonah never saw. And we got Wren's pediatrician records, and we got the text from Nolan, and we got my green notebook, 4 months of it now, in my own hand, dated, witnessed where I could manage it. Jonah and Wren moved into my gray house on the ridge on a Thursday, while Sloan was showing a lake property and Glenda was at her standing hair appointment. By the time Sloan got home to find his closet half empty, Delia had already filed for emergency custody and a protective order, and the petition included the accounting and the texts and the pediatrician's quiet, careful notes about a 3-year-old who flinched. The response was exactly what we'd been told to expect, in exactly the order we'd been told to expect it. First came the love, a flood of it. 20 voicemails in a night. Soaked in tears, baby. I'll change. You know how much I love you and Wren. This is your mother poisoning you. Then, when that didn't work, came the threats, delivered through Glenda in her smooth bank manager voice. If he thought he could humiliate this family, he had no idea what they were capable of. And then came the campaign, the part I'd been most afraid of, because they'd done it before and nearly won. They told the church Jonah had had a breakdown. They told his last few remaining friends that he'd become paranoid and was keeping the baby from her mother. A message went around, anonymous, but we knew the hand that wrote it, suggesting he was a drinker, that he was unfit, that poor Sloan was terrified for her daughter's safety. But this time the women who built the trap walked into one. Every message got traced. Every account that posted a lie got documented. In North Carolina, you can record a conversation you're part of. And so the voicemails Glenda left, the ones where she forgot herself and said exactly what she thought of my son, were preserved word for word. The accountant's report landed like a dropped anvil. And Nolan, God bless that broken, brave man, said he would testify. He said he'd spent 5 years wishing someone had warned him, and he wasn't going to let it happen to my boy and watch. The custody and the financial matter were heard over 2 long days. Sloan came in a soft blue dress, composed, dabbing at her eyes at all the right moments. Glenda sat behind her with her back straight and her chin level, wearing the face of a woman gravely concerned for her grandchild. And it did not matter, not one bit, because the truth had been written down. Nolan took the stand first and described, without anger, without performing, the machine they'd built, the isolation, the money, The mother who engineered it all and managed the exits and made sure there was nowhere left to run. He read the texts where Glenda had coached her daughter on how to make a sane man look mad. The room went still in the way I'd only felt a few times in my whole career, the stillness of people looking straight at something they will never be able to unsee. Then it came out about the money. The accountant laid it on the table in numbers no soft blue dress could soften. 3 years of my son's labor gone into entities he'd never been allowed to see, the same structure almost line for line that Nolan had described from 5 years before, the same methods, the same words, the same mother, building the same cage around a different gentleman. I testified last. I told them what I'd watched plainly, the way I'd written reports my whole life. And when the judge asked me, near the end, whether as a forensic nurse with 19 years in domestic violence I'd recognized the signs early, I told her the truth, because it was the only thing I had left to give. I said no. I said I'd spent my whole career certain I could spot it from across a room, and it had happened to my own child in my own family while I brought casseroles to the very table where it was being done, and I never saw it because I was looking for a man's fist and not a woman's smile. And because I was so deep in mourning my husband that I had no eyes left for anyone else, I said that was my failure and I would carry it, and that the only thing I could do with it now was make sure I told the truth in this room. The judge was quiet for a moment. Then she thanked me, and I understood she'd believed every word. The court gave my son primary custody of his daughter, with the mother's time supervised. The protective order was granted, and the financial matter didn't end in the family court. It went where it should have. Glenda had used her name and her old bank credentials to move money in ways that crossed a line from cruel into criminal, and she was charged for it, and so was Sloan as part of it, and the long, slow machinery of consequence that they'd outrun their whole lives finally caught up. It wasn't prison for life. It was restitution and probation, and for Glenda, a felony fraud conviction at 68 years old, and the community, the church, the real estate world, the women who'd been told my son was crazy, that now knew exactly what those two were. The thing they'd guarded most, the family name, the smooth reputation, was the thing they lost. When the ruling came down, Glenda turned around in that courtroom and looked at me. There was no defeat in her face. There was only disbelief. She had genuinely never imagined the silence could break. She'd built a whole life on the certainty that it never would. I held her eyes until she was the one who looked away. That was almost 3 years ago now. My son and his daughters still live with me some of the time, and the rest in a small, bright apartment in town where the windows have no curtains, because Jonah says he spent 6 years in a house where the blinds were always down, and now an open window feels like being able to breathe. He reopened his workshop, his own this time, his name on every piece of it. The spruce and the varnish are back in the air. Wren is 6, and loud and argues with him about everything, which is the most beautiful sound I've ever heard, because a child who feels safe enough to argue is a child who knows she's allowed to take up space. She didn't used to know that. She knows it now. Jonah is seeing someone, a music teacher named Grace, gentle and steady. The first time they disagreed about something, nothing, where to eat, and his voice got tight out of old habit and he braced for it. She just looked at him and said, "Hey, it's only dinner. We're on the same side." And he told me about it that night with this look of wonder on his face, like a man who'd forgotten that conflict didn't have to be a trap. He said, "She didn't punish me for having an opinion. I had to go into the kitchen so he wouldn't see me cry." And Nolan, the man who called me on a Tuesday with his voice shaking, comes to supper sometimes. He and my son don't talk much about what happened. They talk about ordinary things, fishing and engines and what's wrong with the world. Two men who walked through the same fire separately and came out the other side and found each other there. I set an extra place for him without being asked. As for me, I've started telling this story out loud to anyone who'll listen because I spent 34 years keeping other people's secrets, and I am done keeping the ones that protect the wrong people. So let me leave you with the things this nearly cost me my son to learn. The first is that it does not start with violence. It starts with someone wanting to improve you before they've bothered to know you. Watch the person who's correcting you on the first date. The second is that the one who never raises a hand can be more dangerous than the one who does. Glenda never touched anybody. She just drew the blueprints. Watch for the person who makes the alarming thing sound reasonable. The third is that it can happen to a man, to your strong, quiet boy, and the world's refusal to believe that is exactly the wall the abuser hides behind. The fourth is that money is not separate from this. When someone controls whether you can buy your own lunch, they control whether you can ever leave. So guard your own purse like your life depends on it, because one day it might. And the fifth, the one I'd tattoo on the back of my hand if I could, do not run for the door alone. The leaving is the most dangerous hour. Build your people first. Get your folder ready. You were never meant to do this by yourself, and you don't have to. If this stayed with you tonight, I'm going to ask one thing of you. Not for me, for the person in your life who's gotten quieter this past year, the one who's stopped calling, stopped laughing the way they used to, who checks someone's face before they answer a simple question. It might be a daughter, it might just as easily be a son. Ask them if they're all right, and if they say yes too fast, ask them again, because sometimes it's the second time you ask that finally lets a person tell the truth. I'd love to know what this story left you with and which city you're listening from tonight. Tell me down below. Your voice in that comment section might be the thing that helps somebody you'll never meet finally find their own. For a long time after that courtroom emptied out, I kept turning one thing over in my mind: how a woman who'd spent her whole life cataloging cruelty in strangers could let it grow at her own table. The answer, when I finally let myself look at it straight, was that none of this happened by accident. Sloane found Jonah in the exact season his father died, because grief is a door, and people like her read doors. Glenda built the cage slow, one reasonable-sounding rule at a time, because a fast cage gets noticed and a slow one feels like love. Every cruelty in this story had a cause, and every cause was a choice somebody made and told themselves was fine. That's the part I want you to hold on to. Pain rarely arrives as a thunderclap. It arrives as 1,000 small permissions we give other people to decide who we are. But the same law that built the cage is the one that took it apart. Jonah didn't get free because he got lucky. He got free because, somewhere under all that fear, he still knew the difference between right and wrong. And the day he heard Nolan's name, that buried sense of what was decent woke up and refused to lie back down. Nolan didn't call me out of luck either. He called because, broken as he was, he chose to do the harder, kinder thing and spare a stranger what he'd suffered. Decency is not soft. Decency is what makes a frightened man pick up a phone. And I'll tell you what I learned about my own part. Loving my son was never going to be enough. I had to think, clearly, patiently, the way I'd been trained, instead of charging and furious like my Daniel would have. Rage felt righteous, but it would have cost Jonah everything. So I watched, and I wrote it down, and I waited, and I built a team before I made a single move. Being right is cheap. Being right and careful and prepared is what actually frees somebody. I needed my head as much as my heart, and the hardest lesson of my life was that the two have to work together or neither one is any good. The last piece is the one I'd give to anyone listening tonight, and it's the simplest and the hardest. None of it works without the stubbornness to keep going when going is terrifying. The leaving is the worst hour. Jonah had to walk out of his own house. Nolan had to open a box he'd been hiding from for 5 years. I had to sit at that birthday table and smile while everything in me screamed. That kind of staying power isn't loud. It's a quiet, grinding refusal to give up on a person, even when that person has half given up on themselves. So be a little harder to fool and a great deal harder to break. Watch the one who corrects you before they know you. Watch the one who never lifts a hand but draws every blueprint. And if it's you who's gone quiet, you're not weak, and you're not crazy, and you are not, no matter what they told you, the problem. You just need your head, your heart, and one more day of holding on. That's how my son got his daughter back. That's how anyone does.